Quantum manifestation sounds powerful until you actually try to apply it. You're told that reality exists as infinite possibilities, that your thoughts have a frequency, that through your observation, your intention, your vibration, you collapse the version of reality you want into existence. And for a while, it feels like it should work, but the moment you actually try to use it, something strange happens. You start wondering if you're doing it correctly, you catch yourself questioning your thoughts, you start monitoring your own mind, asking, am I in the right state? Am I aligned with the reality I want? And suddenly you're more aware of everything that isn't working, and it turns into a loop. Like you try to think differently because you want a different reality, but that very effort makes you more aware of your current one. And if you've ever tried to apply this, you've probably felt it, which raises a few uncomfortable questions like, if observation creates reality, why doesn't focusing on something change it? Or if infinite possibilities already exist, what determines which one I experience? Or if this is really how it works, why does it feel so inconsistent? Those aren't small questions because they determine whether this is something that actually works or something that just sounds convincing in theory. Now, where it gets interesting is, I don't think the common explanations of quantum manifestation are wrong. I think they're just incomplete because they tell you what is happening, but not how it is happening. And without that, you're left trying to control your thoughts, your emotions, your state. You try to think positively, you try to visualize clearly, you try to align with a different reality, but none of that feels stable because you're trying to control something without understanding what's actually creating it. So maybe the real question isn't how do I manifest using the quantum field? Maybe the better question is, what is the idea actually describing? And here's what I eventually realized. The problem was never that the idea felt impossible. The problem was that nobody ever explained how it was supposed to work. We kept hearing phrases like collapse reality, enter the quantum field, become the version of yourself, but nobody ever explained what was actually happening between those words and the results people experienced. It's like being handed a map without ever being shown how to read it. The map might be accurate, but without understanding what the symbols represent, you're just staring at shapes on a page. And I think that's what happened here. We were given words like observer, frequency, quantum field, but almost nobody explained to us what those words actually point to in everyday life. So instead of asking whether this is scientifically true, let's ask a different question. What real human experience is this idea actually describing? Because the answer is not hidden inside quantum physics, it's hidden inside something your mind is already doing, something that has nothing to do with wishful thinking and everything to do with how you get through an ordinary day. Now, what I mean by that is, take a moment and look around the room you're in. Really look around, take a moment. Notice the walls, notice the furniture, the light, maybe a window, maybe a fan, maybe sounds coming from somewhere outside. Now the interesting question is, was all of that information only created the moment you paid attention to it? Of course not. It was already there. You simply weren't consciously noticing it, not because your eyes couldn't see it, but because your brain had already decided this isn't important right now. That might sound small, but it's one of the most important things to understand about human perception. Because at every moment your senses are taking in an overwhelming amount of information, far more than your conscious mind could ever process. Like every sound, every face, every color, every moment, every conversation, every smell, every possibility. If your brain tried to process all of it equally, you wouldn't be able to function. You would just freeze under the sheer volume of information. So your brain, it solves the problem the only way it can. It filters. It constantly decides without asking your permission what deserves your attention and what can safely remain in the background. In other words, you never experience objective reality in its entirety. You experience a carefully edited version of it. Not because reality is fake, but because your attention is limited. Think of reality like an enormous library containing millions of books. Every moment your brain walks into that library, takes one tiny stack off the shelf and hands it to your conscious mind and quietly leaves the rest behind. The books you never received were not imaginary, they simply never reached your awareness. By the way, what I'm sharing isn't just theory, it's what took me from being a lawyer to starting my own companies, making six figures in my mid-20s, and later negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. Now, where things become fascinating is that editing process isn't random. Your brain doesn't pick information out of a hat, it uses patterns. It asks questions like, what has mattered before? Or what does this person already believe? Or what are they expecting to find? What feels emotionally important? What fits the story they already believe and have about themselves? The answers to those questions become the instructions to your filter, which means two people can walk through the exact same environment and come away believing they experienced completely different realities. Not because reality changed, because attention did. For example, imagine two people and let's say they're attending a networking event. The room is identical, the conversations are identical, the opportunities are also identical. One person leaves saying there was nobody worth talking to. The other person leaves with three valuable connections, a potential business partner, and an interview lined up the next week. Now, imagine watching the security footage of that event. You would see both people walking through the same room, the same people were available to both, the same conversations were happening, and if you think about what changed, was not reality, was perception. One person's filter allowed certain things into awareness, the other person's filter quietly ignored them. Now, let me give you another example, something most people have experienced. Let's say you've decided to buy a car. This is a car you've never paid much attention to, but suddenly the moment you decide to buy that car, you start seeing that exact model everywhere. On your street, at traffic lights, in parking lots, and it feels though the universe just filled the roads with that car overnight. But obviously it didn't. The cars were already there. Your attention simply changed what it considered relevant. The world looked different without the world itself changing. Now, this is the part where most people hear this idea and say that, are you saying manifestation is just selective attention? Not entirely. Selective attention is part of the mechanism, but by itself, it isn't enough to explain what people actually experience, because noticing something is not the end of the story, it's only the beginning. What matters isn't just what enters awareness, it's what happens after that. Because the moment your attention changes, your behavior starts changing too, usually without you even realizing it. For example, think about confidence for a second. For example, have you ever met someone who seemed incredibly confident? And because of that, they approached more people, they started more conversation, asked for more opportunities, and they ended up creating better results. Now, most people look at that outcome and say they were lucky, but if you rewind the chain of events, luck wasn't where their story actually started. Their internal expectations changed how they behaved, and that behavior exposed them to opportunities that someone else never encountered. The opportunity wasn't magically created, it was encountered because different attention led to different action, and different action naturally produces different outcomes. This is where so many manifestation explanations skip an entire layer, because they jump straight from belief to reality changing, as though the universe simply rearranged itself. But there is a huge middle section which most people never talk about, that belief changes attention, attention changes behavior, behavior changes experience, and experience reinforces belief. That's the loop. I will repeat myself. Belief changes attention, attention changes behavior, behavior changes experience, and experience reinforces belief. That is the loop. And once you see it, you begin noticing something remarkable. Many experiences that feel supernatural, they start looking surprisingly understandable. Not less meaningful, just more complete. Which brings us to the most important question of this video, that if your brain is constantly filtering reality, what exactly decides how that filter is set in the first place? Because this is where manifestation and psychology finally meet. And once you understand the answer, almost every phrase you've ever heard about quantum manifestation suddenly starts making a completely different kind of sense. And if your brain is constantly deciding what enters your awareness, what determines those decisions? The simplest answer is your beliefs. Not just the beliefs you recite out loud, but the assumptions you've repeated so many times that your brain now treats them as reality. Think of your beliefs like settings on a camera. The world outside the lens has not changed, but the moment you adjust the settings, the image changes, and it changes dramatically. For example, when you increase the exposure, the details hidden in the shadows, they suddenly became visible. If you change the focus, something that was blurry a moment ago, it becomes crystal clear. The scene didn't change, the way you captured it did. Your mind, it works in a surprisingly similar way. Your beliefs become instructions and they quietly tell your attention, this is important, this probably matters, watch for this, or you can ignore that. Which means your beliefs don't just influence how you interpret reality after you see it, they influence which parts of reality you notice in the first place. That's an incredibly important distinction because most of us imagine belief working like a judge. Like, for example, looking at evidence after the fact. In reality, belief behaves more like an editor, deciding which footage even makes it into the final film. And once you understand that, a lot of familiar manifestation language, it suddenly becomes much more easier to translate. For example, if you take the phrase raise your vibration, and if we just strip away the physics vocabulary around it, what is that instruction actually trying to accomplish? It's encouraging you to shift into a state where different expectations become possible, where your attention begins looking for possibilities instead of obstacles, where your brain starts asking what could work instead of why won't this work. Notice that's not about broadcasting a magical frequency into the universe, it's about changing the internal instructions your mind is using to filter reality. Or consider another popular teaching, become the version of yourself who already has what you want. That doesn't require a parallel universe, it also doesn't require another timeline, it simply asks a practical question. If you genuinely believed this future was possible, what would you notice today that you're currently overlooking? What conversations would you start? What opportunities would suddenly seem worth pursuing? What ideas would you stop dismissing? How would you interpret setbacks? Would they become proof that nothing is working? Or information that helps you adjust your next step? The circumstances may be identical, but the person moving through these circumstances is not. Their filter has changed, which means their actions change. And over time, their results begin changing too. Now let's revisit one of the biggest phrases in quantum manifestation, the observer effect. This is where so much confusion begins because in quantum physics, the observer effect describes very specific behavior under very specific experimental conditions. It's not evidence that simply wishing hard enough rearranges your everyday life, but as a metaphor, it's actually pointing towards something genuinely useful. The act of paying attention changes your experience. Not because you're collapsing particles across the universe, but because attention determines what enters awareness and awareness shapes behavior. The metaphor survives, the mechanism changes. And I actually think that's a stronger explanation because it gives you something you can actually work with. Think about the difference between these two approaches. The first says, my job is to emit the correct vibration and hope reality rearranges itself. The second one says, my job is to change the assumptions that determine what I notice because what I notice changes what I do and what I repeatedly do changes my life. One approach waits, the other participates. One places almost all of the power outside your conscious influence, the other brings it back to the one place you actually have your leverage, your perception, your interpretation, your choices. None of this means life becomes completely predictable. There will always be things outside your control like unexpected events or bad timing, random chance, other people's decisions. Reality is still reality. This isn't a promise that every desire automatically becomes inevitable, but it does explain why two people can be surrounded by similar possibilities and consistently create very different lives. Not because one person has access to a different universe, but because they're navigating the same universe through a different filter. And that's a much more empowering idea because filters can change, beliefs can change, expectations can change, and when those change, the way you engage with reality changes alongside them. That's how I now understand quantum manifestation, not as physics replacing psychology, but as psychology hidden beneath the language of physics. And once I saw that distinction, the entire idea finally made sense. If you also want to see this same breakdown for the law of detachment or the law of vibration, the links are in the description and on your screen, and I'll see you there.